Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. I have another interview today with Dylan Emerick-Brown. Dylan is an executive coach and does a lot of work, as we'll get into in this conversation, in healthcare spaces. I'm excited to have him on here because he does have a unique background. He comes from the field of education. His background's in literature. He's a published writer and poet and really leans into this idea of narrative when it comes to his coaching. And we have a fantastic conversation around this. I see so much value in his approach to helping people and helping them unlock certain aspects of their career or their life that maybe are keeping them stuck. And so we talk about some of that. One of my favorite parts of the conversation is where Dylan talks about how coaching has made him a better father. And so I love whenever people are engaged in work that feels personal and feels transformative. So let's jump into this conversation with Dylan.
Many years ago, in a past life, I was a high school English teacher. It fulfilled my love of literature. Growing up, I loved reading and writing, and so I surrounded myself with it. And I just love storytelling and the different ways that it can happen, and just communication in general. The way that we choose our diction and syntax, the tone, all of it just fascinated me. And I thought it would get boring for teenagers, but I found ways of making it interesting. And then towards the end of my teaching career, I was thinking, how can I apply this broader? I was kind of the mindset, I was living life at 80%. I was happy enough. I was doing something I was good at and loved, but there was something missing. And I won't go into the whole issues with the education system and things like that, but I realized, because my father was an executive coach for 15 years, and he was retiring around the time I was deciding to make a shift from teaching, that I was basically, in a sense, coaching my students a lot. A lot of what we discussed, either as a class or one-on-one, was very informal coaching. And I really enjoyed that. Even other teachers would comment how the students really trusted me and came to me with things. And I thought, let me give that a shot. And so I went through coactive training and positive intelligence and started coaching, and I just fell in love with it and was like, that's the missing ingredient. That's what I need. And so, my wife was very supportive of me making this shift from something stable and predictable to entrepreneurial, which I'm sure gave her a few heart palpitations. My two children were young enough to not notice too much of a shift, which was good. But yeah, I absolutely love it, and I meet interesting people and do interesting things every day. And so, yeah, I think, and personally, I've got, like I said, a wife, 2 kids, a daughter who's 7, a son who's 4. So when I'm not working, they suck every last inch of energy out of me. And I love it. We go to the beach, playgrounds, play all sorts of games and stuff. And I see a lot of parallel between parenting and coaching, which is a pretty effective segue in coaching for anyone who's coaching someone who is a parent. If they are, a term I use somewhat frequently is emotionally constipated. An in that is usually very effective is to compare what they do as a manager or leader to being a parent. So I get some of my best coaching practice from my kids indirectly.
What a word picture. Emotionally constipated, so.
Yeah, my wife's not a huge fan of it, but,
Hey, let
works.
it fly. So education background, you hit a spot where you said you were living life at 80%. You felt like the coaching piece satisfying something that was just lacking, missing. I say a career shift. I know what you're doing now is a continuation more than a shift. Or, it wasn't a start-stop. It's like, an evolution. Or where are you grateful in coaching that you were a previous former educator?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I don't know, this might sound insulting to some managers or leaders, but, such is life. There's not that much difference between a lot of people I've coached at the C-suite level and teenagers in a lot of sense. You have people who are going through some sort of shift career-wise. There's imposter syndrome usually lurking around, which is very prominent in teenagers as well. Communication issues they're trying to work out, unconscious narratives that creep in that sometimes inhibit their progress. And so learning to work with people on a deeper level, not just address the symptom, but the cause, and to really get at the heart of the issue was something I really honed as a teacher. And also, I do a lot of workshops, group stuff, organizationally. And so the lesson planning, the coming up with assessments and how to interpret those assessments, a lot of that has been very helpful. If I need to create a workshop, which I do frequently for a group, I can do it in a day, easy. So there are a lot of parallels and skills that I honed as a teacher that are very applicable as a coach.
Teenagers have this ability to where some of the, I'm going to use dysfunction as a lack of a better word, immaturity, whatever you want to put there. I feel like that's a bit more, that's just more celebrated as a teenager. C-suite level leaders have been trained to hide things well. It's like I have these feelings of insecurity. I have this imposter syndrome. And instead of it being celebrated, I actually need to be more secretive about it. Or I need to kind of put on that facade that I have the answer, I have it in place. But at the end of the day, we're all susceptible to that. The lie that many people in the mid-level range or entry-level range think, oh, those people higher up in the org chart, once I get there, this stuff goes away. It doesn't. I mean, you see that, I see that. It just takes on, it may look a little different, but at the root of it, it's the same. And I think that's what makes this such a rewarding work as well, because it is so universal and people are people at the end of the day. And I feel like being a coach reminds you of that so much when you see these consistent pain points and patterns in people.
Yeah. And you said something interesting there about the facade that people put on. And it reminded me of another one of those skills where in a classroom, you always hear the phrase, there's no such thing as a dumb question. And I would joke with the students like, that's not true. There are dumb questions. I had a student once after we read Romeo and Juliet, I played the movie, and the student asked, what did Shakespeare think of the movie? So not entirely true, but the parallel is all about psychological safety. As a teacher, you have to create an environment of psychological safety where the students feel comfortable taking a shot, missing the shot, exploring the unknown, because there's so much risk there and they don't want to feel embarrassed. They don't want to feel self-conscious. So there's so much psychological safety that's a key component in the success of a classroom. And it's the same within an organization. And the sad thing is a lot of people at the C-suite level, like you said, they develop this facade where I can't show vulnerability. I can't be wrong. I have to have the answers, which is the complete opposite of what I've fostered in the classroom. And so it's basically getting them to unlearn everything they've learned over those years. And it's sort of like in a fireplace, it builds up with creosote and ash over time, and you just got to like clear that away and get back to that mentality that students have. And it's one of the reasons I really love working with residents in healthcare, whether it's PA residents or other types of residents, because the difference between working with a resident and a seasoned surgeon, for example, that surgeon, like someone at the C-suite level, has built up layer over layer over layer of the person, the facade they have to be. Whereas at the resident level, it's like the teenagers, they're still open-minded, they're malleable, and it's really fostering that psychological safety, because the traditional view of a leader is completely wrong.
I know you mentioned healthcare and residents, and so a lot of the population that you're serving is in the healthcare space. So let's talk a little bit about that. How did you kind of find that healthcare is kind of where you do a lot of your coaching?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I started out coaching, I was casting a wide net. I'm sure a lot of coaches out there who might be listening to this, we've all heard, find your niche. And that's terrible advice for a new coach, because you don't know what your niche is. So I cast a very wide net, and I was coaching lawyers and writers and nurses and all sorts of people, even people at Kennedy Space Center, like all over the place, anyone I could get my hands on. And I started to realize in the mornings when I woke up and I knew kind of what was on my calendar for the day, the people I got excited about, I was really looking forward to, all had one thing in common, and they were in healthcare. So they would be maybe at different levels, different positions, different locations, but they were all in healthcare. And I explored why that was, and I came to the conclusion, I get a real sense of fulfillment helping people who help people. I want to care for our caregivers, because when I was coaching an attorney, for example, who was basically in real estate, as I recall, it was really helpful to that person, which was great. It was fulfilling on a level, but now this real estate attorney is better at being a real estate attorney and having a work-life balance. But I feel like when I help the nurses, the doctors, the people in healthcare, even at the C-suite level, it has this indirect trickle-down effect on the patient care directly. I coached this one nurse during the pandemic who was having difficulty with one of her patients who was dying of COVID. And this was at the height of the pandemic. And she basically lost all empathy for him, because this individual was one of the organizers of an anti-vax rally. And in her mind, she was thinking, you get what you get. This is poetic justice. And at the same time, she knew that wasn't her. This is not why she went into healthcare. This was a patient, and she felt terrible about herself that those were the thoughts in her head. And so she was really wrestling with this. And when we were coaching, she started to develop empathy. She started to become unattached to those unconscious narratives, and was able to see this individual as a father, a husband, a son. And she was able then to work with this individual and his family, mostly with the family, to help them cope with the realization he was going to die. And when he did die, she actually cried about it, not just because here was one of her patients who passed away, which was happening a lot at that time, but she was so thankful that in one of the most challenging moments of her life, she didn't lose herself. She never thought she would be capable of crying for this person a few weeks earlier. And I mean, what else can I say? Like that, what's more fulfilling than being a part of that?
A little bit different than the real estate
The
lawyer
attorney.
situation, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So your fulfillment piece is connected to helping helpers.
Yeah, very much so.
What has coaching helped you discover in yourself? Not what kind of skills have you grown to accomplish the task of coaching, but what has it revealed in yourself, or like reinforced, or maybe it's a new learning you've had about yourself? What's that uncovered in you personally, just as a human?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing that really stands out to me is I really do feel that I am a better husband and a better father than I was before. The things that I've learned that I use in the coaching, I've applied to myself to a large extent. So things like mindfulness, which has been incredibly helpful in shifting my perspective and reducing my temper and frustration level at things outside of my control. I mean, my son was born in March of 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and there was a lot of stress in my life then.
Really?
Yeah. So, I mean, being in the hospital when my son was giving birth, and the people were like, "Oh, you can go to the cafeteria and get some food." I'm like, "There's no way I'm going to the cafeteria in a hospital." But being able to kind of unattach myself and shift my perspective and get in touch with myself in a better way has been instrumental. My patience level with my kids and focusing on what's most important. It's so easy for me to sit there on my phone and go onto LinkedIn and check out things, but there's my kids who are missing quality time with their father. They don't notice it because maybe they're watching TV or whatever, but time flies. And so I think becoming a coach has really helped me become a better person overall, because I focus on what's really important in my life. I, to the best of my ability, try to kind of coach myself.
Yeah, and having I resonate with that so much. You know, you're walking with people who want to be more present. They want to have more work-life balance. They want to, and you know, to be back to what we talked about in the beginning before we started recording, just that the power of authenticity. And so being able to really genuinely help someone needs to come from a genuine spot. When you jumped into coaching, I know you said you got some training and you know you brought your skill set from teaching into it. I would love to get into a little bit. I'm sure your English and language and literature background and all the things has definitely probably influenced your approach. So how has that informed your coaching approach? And what is your coaching approach?
I would say my coaching approach, to kind of start with that question, is it's somewhat varied based on the context. I don't approach every client the same way. I gauge who they are, but staying authentic to myself, what it is they need. Do they, need a little bit more hand-holding? Do they need a little bit more tough love? I typically lean on the tough love part. I don't have a lot of patience for just enabling. I want to see some results, see some progress. But then when it comes to the specific approach as it pertains to my English background and the teaching background, I started to realize early on in the coaching that when I was listening to my client, I was hearing their story, whatever it was, even if they were just giving me bullet points of something, however it is they chose to tell it, they were still telling me a story. If they were telling me about their boss, colleagues, significant other, it's a story. And I started to realize the way that I was listening was with a literary analysis sort of mindset. I was listening to the words that they chose and saying things like, have you noticed you used the word failure 4 times in the past minute? And I'm like, no, because when we speak, it's unedited. We're just unfiltered. And people don't realize what they're saying and not saying or how they're saying it. I could point out, when you were talking about your family, you seemed very loose and relaxed, but then when you talked about this person, you tensed up, you shifted your posture a bit. And so taking that literary analysis approach, I started to craft this, what I call narrative linguistic approach to coaching, where we naturally see ourselves as the protagonist, the main character of our story. And we so often forget we're also the author of that story. We take for granted that that boss who we consider a total jerk, well, we wrote that role for them in our unconscious narrative. They don't wake up every morning thinking, how am I going to make Dylan's life harder? In their mind, they're the protagonist. And so with that realization, helping clients uncover what those unconscious narratives are has been really impactful, because we always see things as like, this is reality, this is the truth, this person's a jerk. But when you shift that perspective, you can then kind of rewrite that character into a new role. And I have tons of examples of it, but it's been really impactful for me as a coach, as a method. And I don't approach it like an English teacher. I don't want the client to feel like a student in my class and we're getting into the structure of a story, but it's just an approach that I take that's been effective.
So much of this is our mindset. It's the words that we prescribe to situations. I'm not a English teacher background, but from a psychology standpoint, the words definitely create worlds and realities. There could be two people who have the same experience, and the words they attach to that experience then produces certain behaviors and results. Just as a coach, just helping through curiosity, be like, hey, you used the word failure 4 times. Like, I had no idea I said that. And it's like, well, why do you think you said that? And so just that curiosity can lead to so many things that on paper is just a word, but it's so much more layered than that. You talked about layers earlier, so much more complex than that. And so when you're using some of the data points that you're pulling directly out of what they're saying, challenging some of that, but then being curious with some of that, and depending on who you're talking to, you can dial up the challenge or dial up the curiosity. And I think that's another really exciting thing that I would imagine similar to your teaching background. It's like you didn't teach every student the same way because they needed a different teacher. Each of them needed something different out of their teacher. People need something different out of their coach. And so, but I love that you said narrative linguistic, if I'm remembering correctly. And there's a framework, but within that, like, it's going to ebb and flow based on who I'm talking to.
Absolutely. And just like a good editor with a writer, a good coach isn't going to rewrite that narrative. I like the example that, you just pointed out. I'm just reflecting back, mirroring some of the observations I've had. The observations are just observations. They're not good. They're not bad. They're not necessarily important or insightful, but just getting them to think about their thinking, and then they decide what they want to do. One of the more interesting examples of it, years ago, I was coaching this Brazilian writer living in Canada, and her visa was going to run out in a few months. And again, it was like towards the tail end of the pandemic. And so she was still kind of isolated, and a lot was going on, and she was trying to get her writing career off. She was a sports writer, and she kept talking about her editors in this negative way. They're holding me back. They're not publishing my work. They're just criticizing. They don't know what they're doing. And clearly she had written a very specific role for them in her life story. So I asked her about it. I said, if you could label them, like what would you label them as? She thought about it for a minute and said, gatekeepers. They're the gatekeepers. They control what gets published, what doesn't, who gets to read my words and who doesn't. And then I asked her, and this was the mindset shift, the chipping away. I asked her, how do you think they see themselves in their narrative? And her gut reaction, which is pretty typical, is, well, how would I know? And I'm like, that's not what I asked you. It's a hypothetical. How do you think they see themselves? She thought about it and she said, well, they probably see themselves as people with decades of experience. They've learned a lot over the years. They've got a lot they could probably teach others, including me, and share. And they probably worked really hard and deserve to be where they are. That's how they see themselves. And so that was the moment where she realized right or wrong doesn't matter, but her narrative isn't reality. It's just a perspective. It's not invalid, but it's a perspective, one of many. And then I asked her, how do you want to see them in your narrative? Like, how do you want them to be? Instead of gatekeepers, which clearly isn't helpful, how would you shift that? And she thought about it, and then she said, mentors. I want to see them as mentors. And we dug into that. What would that look like? What would that feel like? And then so she started treating them like mentors. When she would get the criticism back, instead of looking at it as the criticism of a gatekeeper, she saw it as the criticism of a mentor. And she changed the way that she saw things and did things and worked with them. And then she started getting her work published because she was looking at it through a different lens. The shift in perspective led to a shift in behavior. And it was just by sort of rewriting those people's roles in her narrative. And it was so impactful.
When she was perceiving them as gatekeepers, it was really easy for her to find situations and evidence for them being gatekeepers. It's like she is scraping every conversation, every email, every text, every meeting, and looking for evidence that they're gatekeepers. And she is going to find evidence that they're gatekeepers because she was only seeing that perspective that she had. And so I love that as a coach, you guided her, and you didn't say, think of them as a mentor. Through exploration, you kind of helped her surface that. And then she's able to look at every text, email, critique, meeting, all those things, and find evidence for mentorship. And so much of the words we tell ourselves, the words we prescribe to other people, our brain's powerful. It's really good at filtering out whatever word and label we put on somebody.
So much of what people think about is right or wrong. They think in terms of right or wrong, good or bad, which are just labels we assign things. When my check engine light comes on in the car, I think of it as a bad moment. My car mechanic thinks of it as a good moment. It doesn't matter. It's really which perspective is serving us. And that's what it comes down to. And that's the decision they have to make, like you were saying. The temptation might be there as a coach to be like, come on, go for the mentor. But at the end of the day, it's their call. And that's also what makes it so impactful, is it's their decision.
I've had people before, I'll say, hey, think about childhood, 0 to 18. This is a little bit more of when I'm trying to help clients just get a bit more creative in their thinking. Like if they're very concrete, I just try to open that up a little bit. Like, hey, what's one word you would put on, your childhood, and just kind of see where that goes. And then that's a really zoomed out approach. It's very broad. That can go a lot of different places. I'll follow that up and say, was that word spoken over you, or was that given to you? Maybe you had a grandparent that said, you're anxious, and all of a sudden, like, that's the word you chose, or was it more experienced? No one spoke the word over me, but it's kind of what came from within. And then based on whatever their word is, there's a whole journey of exploration that can kind of come out of that. And, maybe an executive kind of coaching situation. Hey, instead of looking at childhood 0 to 18, what's the last year been like? When you think about the last year professionally, what's one word that you would kind of label that as? And then same kind of thing, like, was that word kind of spoken, or was it experienced? And again, using words, I feel like it can lead to a lot of different places of exploration, and which is really fun for me as a coach. But then it's really helpful for them just to understand and get through some of those layers. But again, just using one word can open up a whole world. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I've found that very helpful in working with people.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the criticism early on with this approach that I heard from some other coaches was it was too cognitive, not emotional enough. And I really pushed back on that because we ascribe, maybe from the outside, it sounds like it's cognitive, it looks cognitive, but we assign so much power and emotion to those words. So if, like the example you gave, somebody says that, oh, I define last year as a struggle. That may sound cognitive, but there's a lot packed into that word struggle that hits an emotional chord for that person. And one of the interesting things, I mean, to take like a more scientific approach is our emotions, our fight or flight reflex is all in the limbic system, the amygdala. And the only way we can tap into that, because I'm not asking my clients to do interpretive dance or anything like that, is to use the neocortex, which is language, reasoning, as sort of a doorway into it. And there is a part of the brain, the posterior cingulate cortex, is a part of the brain where those unconscious narratives reside. And the only way that we can access them and communicate it is through the neocortex, through language, through words. Unless, like, again, you want to do interpretive dance or something. But even if the word they choose is imperfect and they think it's not quite the right word, the fact that they're struggling with it and this is still what they came up with, or this is the metaphor they use, they couldn't think of a word, but it feels like this. And so here's an analogy. Whatever it is they choose is an insight into that part of the brain that has no language. And so I find those kinds of exercises where you just sort of pick a word and label something, they have infinite possibility. They can go down all sorts of rabbit holes.
You know, some of the core values that you list when I was kind of reading through your website, I thought these would be good just to kind of get some of your insights as to how you arrived here. There's a lot of different places you can go when you think of core values and things, but I think this also gives us a little bit of a lens into your worldview, maybe. Passion-driven contribution, genuine relationships, and professional integrity. So give us a little bit of an explanation or summary on those three if you can. I just think that would be really helpful to hear.
How I came to those was actually through an interesting exercise that I do with a lot of my clients, that my dad, who's a former coach, did with me, exploring some of the most impactful moments of my life that I ascribed as either the best or the worst, and digging down and finding the connecting threads, the non-negotiables in those moments. So something like passion-driven contribution, right? That there's got to be, for me, in anything that I do, if there's any sense of fulfillment, it's got to be something that's contributing in a way that I care about. There are an infinite number of ways I can contribute to people, but the passion-driven part is, I guess you could say, kind of selfish. It's got to be a contribution that resonates with me, that makes me feel good, and whatever that happens to be. The professionalism core value, I really take that even into my personal life. If it's something that I care about deeply, I treat it with a level of attention, care, professionalism that is at a very high level. It's something that really matters to me. And I notice in myself, if there's something I deeply care about, and let's say I'm working with someone else on the same thing, and they don't care as much about it, it triggers me. It impacts me. And so I take that level of attention very seriously. I am not the kind of person who has tons and tons of friends. Like, for me, it's a core small group. And even professionally, genuine relationships matter the most to me. It's all of these, what kind of almost makes them core values is they're really hard to explain because they really tap into an emotional chord. But anything I've ever done in my life, personally or professionally, that had any value to me was connected to a genuine relationship. Even if it's one that I just made 5 minutes ago, there's some human-to-human connection there.
Well, there's so much overlap between those, and definitely they feel like they support each other.
Yeah, kind of like Olympic rings. They're all
there
independent,
you go.
But
very timely.
Yeah.
Very timely as we're about to jump into that. Is there a situation of someone that you've coached that you've tried to do the narrative linguistic approach with, and you've seen them be pretty resistant to?
Yeah, there was someone, I mean, there have been a few people where they were kind of skeptical at first and resistant. And sometimes I just stop. If this isn't an exercise or an approach that resonates with you, I'm not going to do it because it's not going to be effective. And this is something not only people being coached, but also coaches need to really understand is it's not so much about the tool, but the tool user. And it's about the impact, not the intention. I have the best of intentions, but if the person is resisting, then I need to pivot and get into where's the resistance coming from. Because it's not the approach. There's something else there. There's something else holding them back. It has nothing to do necessarily with me or the narrative linguistic approach, but there's a narrative they're telling themselves on a deeper level that we need to get at before we take any other approach. So usually when that happens, I just pivot. I stop. And then I explore where the resistance is coming from. And, maybe they'll say they've done something similar another time. It didn't work, whatever. And I just get curious about it and ask a lot of questions. But it comes down to digging at the resistance.
In the next season of your coaching, what do you feel like you're most excited about?
Yeah, so the thing I'm most excited about, and it's very much preliminary, it's there's just irons in the fire, nothing solid. But the thing that I'm most excited about is emotional intelligence development in residencies. Because I've done that. I created and facilitate an emotional intelligence development portion of a PA residency based out in Texas, and I've seen the impact. I've seen the ROI. I've seen not just the financial changes in terms of the lack of turnover, but I've seen the confidence, the impact that it's had. And like we were talking about earlier, getting them when they're malleable instead of these hardened physicians who are very much set in their way. I've seen it work, and I am in very preliminary discussions with other residency coordinators or healthcare professionals or C-suite level individuals at healthcare organizations. And I'm trying to get that buy-in, that engagement, because a lot of residencies have an emotional intelligence portion, but it's taught by people who don't really get that. This isn't their world, and it's more of a box to check because there are models that will assess whether or not you know the model as opposed to use the model. And it's not about a one-off workshop. It's not about, just popping in and teaching this and leaving. It takes time for it to be sustainable, and that's the key, is sustainability. And so the thing I'm very excited about, fingers crossed, in the near future is really taking that approach and scaling it to different organizations and incorporating that emotional intelligence development on a real level in healthcare, so that the residents leave with the skills, the knowledge, and the emotional intelligence portion to really have that holistic education and be the best leaders or managers that they can be in this ever-changing, complex, high-stress environment.